The sky over Dustmere was a brittle stretch of pale blue, the kind that holds its breath before winter breaks loose. The town sat still beneath it, a crooked spine of buildings leaning against time, their boards dry and splintering. The wind didn't whistle, it whispered like it knew too many secrets and had no one left to tell. In the shadow of the old forge, where the anvil had long gone cold, stood a boy with ash on his boots and sorrow tucked quiet behind his ribs. Eli Harper was 14, though he wore his age the way worn boots wear dust, subtle and slow. The man who raised him, Old Ben, the blacksmith, had been lowered into the ground just 5 days past, with no preacher words and only 2 townsfolk in attendance. No one cried. Eli hadn't either. His grief was quieter than tears. It lived in the way he stirred his coffee without drinking, in the way he counted coins twice though he already knew they weren't enough. Now he slept in the forge, unclaimed and unwanted, with only a stray cat and a rusted horseshoe nail for company. It was near sunset when he saw her. She wasn't from Dustmere, that much was clear from the shape of her walk, the way her knees bent as if bracing for the earth to give way. A girl, maybe 13, her black hair tangled and caked with dry blood. She wore a deerskin tunic torn at the sleeve, and one foot was bare, dragging behind her like she didn't feel it. Her eyes, dark and unflinching, met his across the town's edge where the fence posts ended and the open dirt began. He watched her lean against a water barrel, then slowly slide to the ground. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The sheriff passed by not 2 minutes later and squinted at her. "Best not go near that one, boy," he said without stopping. "Stray like that? Trouble." Then he spat and disappeared into the saloon. But Eli didn't move. He stood there watching her chest rise and fall, shallow and slow. Then, without a word, he took the biscuit from his pocket, half stale, half crumbled, and walked over. She blinked once but didn't flinch when he knelt beside her. He didn't ask questions. He just offered her the biscuit. She took it with shaking hands and wolfed it down in 3 bites, then leaned her head against the barrel and closed her eyes again. A trickle of blood stained the collar of her shirt, and Eli knew she wouldn't make it through the night if left out in the cold. That evening, after the sun slipped away and the wind turned sharp, Eli lit a fire behind the forge using bits of fence post he'd broken off in secret. He dragged out an old horse blanket and laid it on a pallet of straw. Then he carried her, light as a sack of kindling, into the warmth. She didn't speak. Not even when he washed the blood from her temple with a rag dipped in warm water. She just stared at the fire like it held answers. When he brought her a tin of watered-down stew, she took it, sipped it slowly, and then did something that caught him off guard. She handed it back before it was empty. For Eli, that was more than manners. It was a sign. She trusted him, if only a little. By morning, the town already knew. That was how Dustmere worked. News moved faster than horses. Miss Hattie, who ran the dry goods store, wouldn't look him in the eye when he came for bread. Mr. Tiller muttered something about savages and shook his head. One boy, Luke Evans, whose father owned the saloon, spit at Eli's boots when he walked past. "I heard you're harboring one of them," Luke said. "You're filth." Eli didn't answer. He kept walking, fists tight, jaw tighter. He'd heard worse. But when he returned to the forge and found the girl, still sleeping, skin pale, ankle swollen, something inside him twisted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't duty. It was something more dangerous than either. It was care. That night, while the girl dozed, he found an old wooden sled in the shed behind the forge. He pried off the bent runners, replaced them with barrel staves, and made a crude travois, something he'd seen in books, something tribes used to carry the wounded. He didn't know where to go exactly, but he figured if she had family left, they'd be out toward the canyonlands, where the trees grew thicker and white men didn't dare settle. The next morning, he approached her with the blanket again and pointed to the sled. "I'm taking you home," he said softly. For the first time, her lips parted. Her voice was dry and low, barely more than wind. "Usha." He blinked. What's that mean? She touched her chest gently. Home. Eli nodded once. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. But that word tied them together more firmly than any introduction. They left at dawn. No one tried to stop them. A few watched from porches, eyes narrowed, arms crossed, but no one said a word. Eli had packed dried apples, a canteen, and 2 biscuits. The girl, who now leaned on a walking stick he'd carved from pine, gave him a nod when they crossed the town's outer fence. They walked in silence, boots crunching dry underbrush, wind curling around their bodies like a second skin. The sky was bigger out here. Wider. Lonelier, too. That night they camped beneath a thicket of cottonwoods. The stars blinked above like watchful eyes. The fire crackled low, more smoke than flame, and the girl finally spoke again. "My name is Tala," she whispered. Eli looked up from the fire. "Mine's Eli." She nodded once. "You're kind." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But he watched her tuck the blanket tighter around her shoulders and lie back, eyes tracing the stars. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a ghost. By morning, the frost clung to their boots and the wind bit harder. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people walking the same road for different reasons, yet leaning toward the same light. They weren't far from the canyonlands now. The trees were growing taller. The rocks were starting to redden with iron and memory. And Eli, boy with no people, was no longer just surviving. He was searching. The days bled into each other like brushstrokes on a storm-dark canvas. The land shifted as they moved farther from town, no longer soft with prairie grass but jagged with stone and heat-cracked trails. Eli walked with blistered feet and sunburned shoulders, guiding the travois behind him like a plow horse. Tala sat quietly, her ankle bound in his old handkerchief, her eyes always searching the horizon. She didn't ask to stop. She didn't complain. But now and again she'd murmur a direction, sometimes just a glance, sometimes a word he didn't understand. Eli trusted her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because she'd never asked for anything. Maybe because, in the quiet, she reminded him of who he wanted to become. They shared meals in silence. Dried rabbit one day, a handful of berries the next. At night, they curled beside the embers of their fire, the stars stretching endless above them. The woods spoke in creaks and sighs, but Eli found comfort there. It felt honest. Out here, no one whispered behind his back. No one spat at his feet. The forest didn't care where he came from or who had left him behind. On the 4th morning, they crossed into a narrow gorge where the rocks stood tall like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The wind funneled through it, low and mournful. As they walked, Tala's head rose. She paused. Her eyes grew wide, not with fear, but recognition. She placed her hand against one of the stones, closed her eyes, and whispered something in a tongue that curled like river smoke. Eli didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. He could feel it, something was changing. Just ahead, the gorge opened into a small basin dotted with rabbit brush and sage. Smoke rose gently in the distance, 3 thin columns straight as arrows. Tala pointed toward them, a faint tremor in her hand. They approached slowly. Eli kept his posture straight, shoulders square, though his heart pounded like a war drum in his chest. He could feel the air thickening. It wasn't fear, not exactly, it was reverence. Like stepping into a church made of stone and sky. The warriors emerged without sound, stepping from behind rocks and trees like they'd grown from the ground itself. Their faces were painted in earth tones, lines drawn like maps of battle and sorrow. 30 men, silent, still as mountains. Their bows were unstrung, but the tension in their presence was sharp enough to slice bone. Eli instinctively stepped in front of Tala, one hand out, the other curled tight at his side. He didn't speak. Words would have sounded cheap in the face of that stillness. He only waited. Tala limped past him, walking toward the oldest man in the group, a tall warrior with white streaks in his hair and a necklace of bear claws across his chest. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched his arm. For a moment no one moved. Then the man exhaled, a deep, shuddering breath, and folded her into his arms. A ripple passed through the warriors. Some closed their eyes. One let out a soft chant, low and mournful. The others lowered their weapons, not out of fear, but out of respect. Tala turned back to Eli then. Her face had softened, but her eyes still held that quiet fire. She motioned for him to come closer. He hesitated, unsure, but obeyed. The older warrior studied him. No malice in his eyes, just weight. The kind that measured a soul without needing to ask its story. After a long moment, the man placed a hand on Eli's shoulder and gave a single nod. One of the other warriors stepped forward and draped a woven blanket over his back. It was warm, smelling of cedar and smoke, stitched with patterns he didn't recognize. He didn't understand the words they spoke next, but he understood the meaning. He was safe. He was seen. That evening, Tala sat beside a fire, surrounded by women who braided her hair and hummed songs older than the land. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, giggling at Eli's presence. He felt awkward, tall and pale and unsure where to place his hands. But he stayed. Because when Tala looked over and offered him a piece of roasted maize, she smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough. And for him, that was more than enough. He slept that night beneath a cottonwood tree, the firelight flickering on the trunks like old spirits dancing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, he didn't dread the morning. When the sun rose, he packed his satchel quietly. He hadn't said it aloud, but he knew he couldn't stay. These people weren't his, no matter how kind they'd been. He belonged nowhere, and maybe that was fine. Maybe his place was between places, guiding others home even if he never quite found one himself. Tala approached as he finished tying his boot. She looked at him a long time, then held out a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was a string of beads, turquoise, bone, and one carved piece of cedar, etched with a symbol he didn't recognize. He looked at her, unsure. "Protection," she said simply. "For the road." He nodded. No thanks, no goodbye, just understanding. The walk back to Dustmere was quieter. His boots were lighter, his chest less tight. When he reached the edge of town, he saw them before they saw him. 30 warriors, standing in formation outside the forge. The townsfolk had gathered, unsure whether to be frightened or furious. The sheriff stood stiff, one hand near his holster, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. Eli kept walking. He passed the sheriff without looking. Walked right up to the forge. The warriors didn't speak, didn't move. They simply stood as one, their presence a wall of silence and steel. When he reached the door, he turned around. "They're here for me," he said. No one responded. A few townspeople began to retreat, unsure what sort of boy could command that kind of protection. Eli didn't correct them. He didn't boast. He simply opened the door to the forge, stepped inside, and lit the hearth. He worked that day like it was any other. Fixed a kettle. Sharpened a plow. The forge sang again, for the first time in months, and the flames licked the air like a promise. By sunset, the warriors were gone. Not a footprint left behind. But from that day on, no one spat at his boot. No one whispered behind his back. Miss Hattie started setting aside extra biscuits for him. Luke Evans stopped sneering. The sheriff tipped his hat without a word. And once every full moon, a small bundle would appear by the forge door, dried meat, braided corn, a feather wrapped in string. He never saw who left them. But he always smiled when he found them. Eli Harper, orphan of no people, had become a name spoken with care. Not because he fought. Not because he shouted, but because he walked a girl home, and in doing so, found the road he'd always been meant to take.